welcome back to the Beloved interview series here on Beloved Revealed. In the past, we've interviewed people to try to define the term of beloved, and now we're kind of getting into more niche topics. So today we'll be talking about mental health with my dear friend Ruthie from high school, and I'm honestly just going to hand it right over to her right away to do a little bit of an introduction of who she is and what she's gonna talk about today. So Ruthie, take it away.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for having me. So my name is Ruthie Dubois, my last name. So I work in mental health. I'm a mental health therapist in Ohio. And I work at a private practice. So I work with adolescents, adults, families. In the past, I've worked with substance use. I've worked in residential treatment. And I've worked in schools. So I've seen like a lot of different types of mental health issues. I have a master's degree in clinical mental health counseling, and I am a registered licensed professional counselor in Ohio. So basically what that means is that I'm a therapist. So like a lot of fancy terms. And then I have a concentration in substance use. So I am also technically a substance use counselor, though that's not really what I do now. So today I'm here to talk about mental health, basically.
Woo! Yes, you are. Yeah, so kind of like the first thing we wanted to dialogue about was mental health and religiosity in general. So how can prayer and mindfulness and faith positively contribute to mental health? If you can touch on that a little bit, but also throw in some of the drawbacks of when it comes to mental health and religiosity as well, because I know that those are definitely present.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of positive, so I guess if we're talking about, do you want me to specifically talk about Catholicism, Christianity, or like all religions?
I honestly, I was a religious studies major, so I love to talk about all religions, but talk about what you feel like most fit and like qualified to talk about, if that makes sense.
That's perfect. That's perfect.
Yeah.
Okay. So prayer and mindfulness can be a really beneficial tool in terms of mental health, because essentially we know, right, tons of research says that mindfulness, meditation, yoga, even like slow yoga nidra, can all be really impactful for your mental health, because it forces your body and your brain to come back to your nervous system and slow down, essentially. And when it comes to prayer, sometimes prayer can kind of do that same thing. I'm sure, I mean, everyone's prayer life is different, but some people, when they start praying, also get into this place of like, I'm okay, I'm here, these are the things that I need in my life, these are the things that I'm struggling with. So you're essentially like laying that all out there. And that process in and of itself can be really great for your mental health, because you're getting into that place of like, what am I upset about right now? What am I worried about? What am I concerned about? And most of the times our prayers can come from that space, or they can come from the space of like, I'm praying to praise you, and I'm just kind of focusing on that, which is also can be a positive experience in the sense that you're outside of yourself, like you're thinking about things bigger than yourself. You're not so caught up in here's how I feel, here's what's going on with me right now. So I think prayer is also, just to start off, a great way to implement a sense of religiosity into your mental health routine, I guess is maybe what I would call it. And then on top of that, I think depending on how you connect to your religion, so it could mean like service, like going to mass, that in and of itself can also be a great mental health practice, because again, you're taking that hour to just not be on your phone, not sitting there thinking about what you're anxious about, not being worried about everything around you, and allowing you to kind of come back to this center of like, here I am, I'm existing, I'm doing something that I believe is important for me. And I'm thinking about things bigger than myself. And that statement alone, I mean, when we think about what is anxiety, like where does anxiety stem from? A lot of the times it's, first of all, the lack of control. I can't control something, like, which sucks. Like whenever I break down anxiety to people, I'm like, at the foundational core, it's, I can't control something. And that's really hard, because I think anxiety can become so overwhelming that it's hard to think about it in the simplistic term of like, it's really just something I can't control, and I'm freaked out about that. And so whenever you're in a situation like mass, there's nothing around you to control. There's nothing that you can focus on controlling in that moment. Well, unless you're serving in mass or you're doing something. But in general, as like a parishioner, there's nothing that you can really get that stressed about in that moment about like, here's what I can't do, here's what I'm not doing well enough, right? Because your job is just to show up. There's nothing else that's really expected out of you except to show up. And so that kind of brings you back to that place of like, it's okay. I'm doing a good job. I'm okay right now. Everything's all good. And that, like, I would say religiosity has that same component of like, when you can't control things, we get so caught up on, here's the things that I'm worried about happening tomorrow. Here's the things I'm worried about happening next week. Here's the things I'm worried about happening in the rest of my life. Getting caught on these spiraled thoughts. But the reality of the situation is religion is also founded on the belief that you aren't in control. So even as much as you want to be in control, you're not. So I think sometimes that can lead to a relief of anxiety, and sometimes that can contribute to even more increased anxiety. So yeah, that's one of my thoughts, is that like sometimes that can lead to this sense of, I can't just make everything happen. And I'm also praying and I'm hoping and I have these intentions and these things that I want to happen, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they will. And so I guess there can be strength and there can be some relief in that process, but there also can be some increased anxiety in that process, especially because unfortunately religiosity as a whole kind of has this tendency to lean into, here's what you should do, here's what you shouldn't do, here's how you should be, here's how you shouldn't be. So kind of boxing people into these specific roles and specific decision making. And so with that can kind of increase, so as we talked about, you kind of asked like, what are some of the drawbacks? Like with that process can kind of increase the sense of, I need to be this perfect person. I need to be able to manage everything that's offered to me. I need to be able to respond to situations with grace, even whenever I'm upset. I need to be able to overcome my mental health issues to be of service to others. Like there's so many pressures that can come with such strict religiosity of like, this is what I need to be, and this is who I'm supposed to be. So I think sometimes religion starts to become kind of like a self-punishing or a shaming tool, in the sense of like, I did this thing and that wasn't something that I deemed appropriate when I'm looking at it from the lens of my religion, and now I'm ashamed of myself and there's no coming back from it. Like sometimes people get caught in this spiral of, I've already made the decision, it's done. In a sense, essentially get caught in that rigidity of religion. I wouldn't say that that's a commonplace, but I do think some people get caught in that religious, this is how it is and this is how it needs to be, as opposed to the flexibility that I believe to exist within Christianity. But that's open for interpretation. So that's the power of religion. Yeah. But I believe that Christianity has that sort of, you're welcome to come as you are. And we appreciate and love you as you are, but we also believe that you are capable of a lot. So we're going to push you and encourage you to do what you can to make a change in the world, to become the best version of yourself, things like that. So there's a type of therapy called dialectical behavioral therapy, which I sometimes use in my sessions. And it comes from the idea that, like, the dialectical term essentially means that there's two parts of ourselves. One part of ourself that can accept, here's where I am, here's what I'm like. I'm an anxious person. I'm not always the nicest. I just listen. I'm not saying that about myself, but I mean, those were examples, but these are things like we have ideas about ourselves, right? We all tell ourselves stories about who we are, who we want to be. And so that the one part of the dialectical belief is that you can accept that, like, these are things that aren't good about me, and these are things that I want to be better at. And at the same time, you can say, I accept myself for not being perfect, and I challenge myself to do better. So that's the other side of the dialectical coin. That's why it's a dyad. But I believe that Christianity also kind of comes from that same realm of, like, our God is not a God that would say, I don't accept you because of the way that you act or because of the way you think you do. I no longer love you, right? Like, that's not what my God believes. My belief of God is that you're still loved by him. But at the same time, there's a challenge to do better and to be better and to move forward. And to, instead of getting stuck on the things you've done in the past, using them as a learning tool for what I can do in the future and how I can be better. So that kind of like combination.
I really like what you were saying, like in the first half of things about like control, because I think in my own experience of just Catholicism in general, or just of God in general, is like, if I can't have control, and like at the beginning of my faith, I was like, I don't even know if you exist. Like, do you actually have control? And I think that led to a lot of anxiety, is like this whole control factor. So I feel like my anxiety is put into better terms now. Like anxiety is feeling like you don't have control over something. And I feel like in faith, a lot of the time, like I'm thinking of a specific song called Control by 10th Avenue North. And it's all about just like handing over your life to God and like having him have control. Or even like in Yoga with Adrienne on YouTube, she's always like, hand over like your anxieties, your feelings, like let your body have control of these, and like just like breathe them in, breathe them out. So I actually like, I do think that prayer and mindfulness can play a strong role in like regaining control, or like letting something other than yourself have control over your life, if that makes sense. So I just really like that topic of control in general.
And I think even the belief of like, even being able to say to yourself, I actually don't have control over the situation. So me sitting here and getting hyper fixated on it isn't going to help me. Yeah. That in and of itself is some level of control, right? Like being able to say, I'm actually giving this over to God. It's like what you were just describing is this idea of like, I'm not in control right now. I'm giving this to God. That is a way of actually kind of regaining control to some extent. And same with like, I love Yoga with Adrienne, I will say, but same with those videos where she kind of, yes, the same idea of like, I'm not going to just let it resist, like sit in my head and just go through this spiral. Instead, I'm going to put it into my body and I'm going to let it go. And great, easier said than done. I'll always acknowledge that. Like I can say that right now, and that's a totally different situation. Yeah. I can acknowledge that. But I also think like, when we think about anxiety, that's the stem, is like this idea that you can't control things. And I guess I'm focusing a lot on anxiety because I think while depression is really common also, and there's so many mental illnesses that are common, I think anxiety is one that every single person has experienced at some point. But maybe they didn't know that's what it was. Every single person has experienced at some point, but some people get to the point where it's debilitating, right? But I think sometimes too, I always say depression and anxiety are best friends. So even if you have depression, oftentimes you're also experiencing anxiety to some extent. They work together. They're like peanut butter and jelly, unfortunately. but they really go together. So I just want to make that note that at no point am I like belittling the fact there's other mental illnesses. I just think anxiety is often the most relatable and often most tangible symptoms of like, I felt this way, so I did this thing. I think depression can sometimes be a little more confusing in that sense. And then of course, like all other mental illnesses, they get more complex as we keep going. But one of the things I was thinking about as I was preparing to talk about this too, is like, sometimes with mental illnesses like OCD, you get caught on that obsessive spiral of, well, I think OCD, there's a lot of misconceptions about OCD, about what it is, why it happens, but OCD, essentially, my real quick definition of OCD, there's the obsessions, it's obsessive compulsive disorder, right? So obsessions are the things that are going on in the head. Here's the things I'm thinking, here's the things that I believe are going to happen. And the compulsion is the way to manage that anxiety. So an example of that might be, some people have like an obsessive thought of like, what if I accidentally kill someone? Like they're like, what if I accidentally, and they're just sitting there anxious about what if I accidentally kill someone? And for some reason, their body and their brain decide that if I check the light switches and I make sure the doors are locked and I wash my hands, if I do these things, it decreases my anxiety over the situation because I have control over all these things. So that makes me feel less anxious about the idea that I might accidentally kill someone today. And like, while we talk about that, that's totally different, right? Like that's easy for me to define and say, like, this is an example of it. But with OCD, it can become so debilitating that you're having these obsessive thoughts nonstop. So sometimes I've seen prayer be used as a compulsion to manage that obsession. So then it gets to a point where it's unhealthy. If I have to pray the Hail Mary 14 times to relieve the anxiety that I might, I don't know, I'm trying to think of an obsession that something bad might happen today. And I prayed the Hail Mary 14 times and then something bad didn't happen. So that's my new routine, is I have to pray. It becomes this, it's feeding back into the cycle, right? Of like, this prayer is offering some level of anxiety relief, but in a way that's unhealthy because it's actually still feeding into the mental health symptoms. So sometimes religion can also be used in a way that's contributing back to the struggle. And the problem is that it might be considered socially acceptable, right? Like it might be socially acceptable for someone to say, I do the rosary every morning, but we might not know that they're like, I do the rosary every morning because I think that if I don't do it, something terrible will happen. Yeah. There's a difference between I just happen to like doing the rosary every morning, or I have this never ending thought that if I don't do this, then this is what's going to end up happening. And it's something
Yeah.
that's like, can't be really connected.
I also even think like there's a novenas where you pray like 9 days straight. And like I have even been stuck in the routine of like, I need to do this for 9 days or else I will not get like the answer to my prayer, or else like all this stuff. So I've even been in the loop before, and it's definitely not a good loop to be in. And a lot of times like Christian culture in general is like, to heal your anxiety, to heal your OCD, to heal your depression, pray. And I'm like, but what if that is feeding into some of, you know, those symptoms as well? Like how do you balance that type of thing?
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And like sometimes too, that it can become like I was saying, like a socially acceptable version. Because if people are telling you you're depressed, like just pray about it, and you won't be, then you're also in this cycle of shame of, they told me I'm just supposed to pray and it's supposed to go away and it's not working. Like you're
God
also,
must hate me because it's not helping me. Like,
and this must mean I'm a terrible person. And like, he wants me to go to hell. And like, and it becomes this whole thing. And like,
it's real.
Those thoughts. That's why I use that language, like the stories we tell ourselves, because it doesn't necessarily mean it's a reality, but that's a story we tell ourselves, is like, someone told me that I was just supposed to pray and it was supposed to go away and it didn't work. So here I am.
Back at like phase 1 again, like now what?
And then it's also like creates this conflicting view of your God, right? Like it's like, this is supposed to be like an all-knowing being that I believe loves humanity, right? But also here I am struggling with depression, and this doesn't feel like love to me, right? Like it creates this cycle of like, if it were really just I prayed away, why am I still here? Why is it still happening?
So what, like, I don't know if it would be based off of personal experience or just like clients that you've seen, like how would you go about building a relationship with God, like among all of like these mental health struggles, if that makes sense? Like, because I know like Christianity and any religion is community based, and a lot of the time like communities can also have negative characteristics, like where if you know are gay, like you are not allowed to like be in our group, or like just, you know, seclusion and oppression happens in Christianity and any religion. So I'm wondering, like on a personal level, like faith is so important to believe in a God in a personal level among community. And I'm wondering like if you have any thoughts about that or any advice for like building a personal connection with God.
And I think, I feel like anytime there's a group of people, there's a lot of imperfection. And unfortunately, that can lead to a lot of people being hurt, and it can lead to a lot of isolation. It can lead to so many things. But absolutely, I think one of the things that I would encourage people to do in general is, if it comes to like, I want to have a personal relationship with God, but I've been stunted by the community. I've been put into situations where I feel like people were doing things in the name of God that I don't believe in, or that I can't get down with. Like, I just can't connect to that. It then transitions into the idea of like, well, why do you want to have a connection with God? What's your motive here? What's your intention? And I think that's one of the things you can ask yourself too, is, am I praying right now because I think something bad will happen if I don't? Or am I praying right now because I feel inclined to do so, because I feel like that's something I can lean on? And is it giving me a positive connection with God, or is it making it more about like, here I am because I have to do this, or something happens, or because someone told me I'm supposed to pray? And I also think that sense of community can become, it can really make the concept of Christianity disenchanting, to say the least. Like, it can kind of break down like, here's the things that I imagined it to be, and here's what's actually happening. So I would say, even in my own life, like there's been times in my life where I've been in groups of people where I think in theory, like this is great, and this is a supportive, like faith-based group. But then I start to see things where I'm like, no, like, why are you saying that? Like, why did we do that? Like things where you're just like, I don't actually think that's what God would want. And that's not my version of Christianity. Like, that's what I don't believe. I just don't believe that sometimes you meet people and you're like, oh, I wouldn't do that in the name of God. Like, it's one thing to be like, I'm human, I'm making a mistake and I did it. But to say like, this is what Christianity is, can kind of deter a lot of people from the situation. So I think having that personal relationship with God has to be founded on the belief that like, you deserve a personal relationship with God, and that you are capable of doing that without without shame, without people telling you need to, without feeling like that's your only option right now. So even checking in with yourself, like, am I doing this for me, or am I doing this because of X, Y, and Z, like all these other things?
Yeah. And I also think that gets into like the stickiness of like, what is the faith that you were baptized in for us? Because it's like, I was baptized Catholic, and, I grew up Catholic in Catholic schools. I was learning all this stuff, but I like didn't really have questions yet until I was like end of high school, beginning of college. And then when the questions pop up, you're like, am I supposed to be Catholic? Like, do I believe in the Catholic Church? And like, I know that it's rooted in love. I know that any religion is rooted in like God is love, or the higher being is love. But like, I think it's so important to also dive deeper into like beyond the headlines of what religions are advertised as, like diving into the catechism and like diving into, just teachings of your religion, and trying to figure out like why is this love, or like, do I agree with this, do I agree with that? And like, it's so important not to just be like baptized and do nothing. Like, I actually think it's really important to study your faith, or to like ask questions and like be curious, because a lot of the time when, I don't know, even I felt this way in high school a little bit. I felt like I couldn't ask questions, or else I would be like, looked down upon by other people, or like by teachers or things like that. And like, that's not how it should be. I actually think questions and curiosities are so important to developing a relationship with any God.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I was banned from asking questions in high school religion. So
were you actually?
That was a real thing. Yeah. I was told I was not allowed to ask questions anymore.
Oh my gosh.
So yeah, no, I totally agree. Like, I think those questions are where you start to learn. Like, that's where you start to, because those questions to me, that stemmed on like your personhood, like who you are as a person. You're like, I want to understand this. It's not someone told you need to ask more questions. Someone told you need to just do this thing. You're coming from a place of like genuine curiosity. And I think that is something that you don't really get much in other parts of life. Like, that's something that I think is really cool about religion, is that you have like this genuine sense of curiosity, and I want to understand more. I want to know more. I think for me, as I got older, what really helped me is to understand and learn about Catholicism, in the sense that I was like, these are the things I struggled with in Catholicism. But it also turns out like some of these aren't church doctrine. I don't have to believe that. And like starting to understand as I got older, like some things are doctrine and some things are like personal beliefs.
Right.
It's not like I'm like, oh, you don't actually have to believe all that. Or like, even like, there's a lot of Catholic leaders now who've taken like what we know to be true in the Bible and have kind of said like, here's how that can fit into your life. Like, here's what we know. Or even when I was in high school, one of the things I really struggled with is the role of women in the church. Because quite frankly, there wasn't much for women to do in the church. So as I got older, I like had to seek out women who had been important in their churches, like their specific churches, meeting nuns who had done a ton of service work, had changed the lives of so many people, and had felt empowered in that, and were acknowledged for their work. And I think that's one of the things where it's like, when you have problems with the religion because it was just told like, this is what happens and you're just supposed to believe it. Like, I think the best thing you can do is ask those questions and seek out answers and find people. And like, in grad school, I was majoring in mental health counseling, and I even had a priest in one of my classes. And I think even just knowing him in adulthood and like hearing his thoughts on things was so helpful, because there'd be situations where like it would come up like, well, what if you had a client who had just had an abortion? Like, how are you going to respond to that as a priest? And like, I think even like it was great to learn from, but I felt bad for him, he was often placed into a corner where he had to back himself out. But I think being there and just kind of like listening to a priest kind of actually exemplify what I believe to be Catholicism, and him to say like, that's not my place to judge. This is not between me and them. That's between the Lord and them. And like, here's what I would do. And here's how I'd respond to that situation. And just kind of come in with these open arms of like, it's not my place to judge. That's not my role. And that's not who I want to be. And that's not the point of a priest. Instead, I'm there to be a guidance in this specific type of this specific part of their life. So I can help them understand things through the Catholic lens, but my job isn't to come in and tell them they did the right or the wrong thing. And even just kind of like learning from people in that sense can be so helpful. I don't really know where I was going with this, but
no, I definitely think just like the root of like faith is to love others and like to just shut down and like not include people in your space or in your faith because like they are different or they have different experiences than you. Like that's just not how you approach like evangelizing in general. Like you approach it as, I was watching this video with Father Mike Schmitz, who's amazing, but he was saying like, I was just on a plane sitting next to a guy and the guy dropped like nonchalantly like, oh yeah, I went to church like over the weekend, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, you go to church? Like I go to church too. And like, if he didn't say it, like they might've never talked about faith or God, but like the opportunity was presented. And I like think that's so important to enter into conversations and relationships with other people as like, let me get to know you as you are. And then like, if like faith comes around, like that's amazing. Like, let's talk about it. Let's like, help you see, you know, the Catholic faith through, you know, the Catholic lens of your own life. But I don't know. Yeah, that's interesting.
I was privileged to go to a university that was like a Jesuit university. So religion was never a thing where it was like, I just learned it in high school and then never touched it again. It was still very much, I was learning about Catholicism. It wasn't just like, I learned it and then got to choose if I went to church or not. So I think for me in college, coming from this space of like, I hope everyone's university is this way where you're meant to argue and learn and kind of come from this place of like, does this make sense? Can I make it make sense? Like, can I figure this out? And that helped me so much, is just to be able to get to this point of like, I can explain and understand and conceptualize this thing. And I can make sense of certain topics. And I can also come from a place of like, well, there's some wiggle room here. Like there is some room for debate. And that's kind of the point. Like, I think sometimes when you're younger and you're taught religion, that is straight away from out of fear of you making the wrong choice.
Yeah.
So sometimes things aren't explained because people don't want you to end up choosing the thing that they didn't want you to choose. But I think as I got older, it was more of like, well, now I actually can make sense of it. And I don't have this, this sense of like a distortion where I believe one thing, I'm practicing another thing. I need to like make sense of it together. But
yeah. I think it's like, obviously you have to learn the basics of your faith, like as you grow up, but I think it comes with development. Like that's the beauty of like universities in general, is just like the room for, I hope, like you said, I hope that everyone has a college experience where you can debate in class, because like, that's the best part, is asking questions. And I just think it's so important to ask questions. So keep asking questions, everyone. And I also find that like when I studied Catholicism, like it actually helped me grow in personal relationship with God more, and the fact that like, oh, like what they're saying actually like really does make sense. There's a lot of truth and beauty and like care in that. And like it took me diving into teachings and like getting to know the teachings and asking questions in order for me to like feel confident that like God does have control, or like God is real, or just all of these elements of life.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree.
Yeah. So tying it back to kind of just mental health in general, what are your suggestions for like Christian therapists versus, you know, non-Christian therapists? Because I know I see a Christian therapist just because like my faith is like super important, and I know I could bring that into therapy anywhere, but I just felt like I would be like well supported if I had a Christian therapist. But what is your viewpoint? Because I know you're not technically a Christian therapist, but you bring faith into your sessions as well.
Yeah. So, that's a great question. So I would say in general, like the educational aspect of being like a faith-based therapist has kind of shifted, because now like every program in mental health should be teaching people about general like religions. Like they should know enough about each religion. Like part of my job is knowing a little bit about like Hinduism, knowing a little bit about every religion. So if someone comes in and says, this is my religion, I can make sense of it and I can conceptualize what they're talking about. I know like, oh, they have one God, they don't have one God. Like I can kind of understand it. But I would say if you're going into therapy with the intention of, I really want this to have a religious focus, it would not hurt to look up Christian therapists. Like it would not hurt at all. But another thing you can do is like, I market myself as being a mental health therapist who can be faith-based if you prefer. So like, that's the language I use, is if you want it to be faith-based, I can help you with that. But if you don't want it to be, then we don't have to touch upon it at all. And so anytime you're calling to set up an appointment with a new therapist, like even just asking, do they have any background in faith-based therapy? Like, is this something they care about? Is this something they can implement? Because therapists are humans too. And even though we should all be trained in all types of religions and understanding and respecting religions, again, they can be humans too. So you can be kind of entering into a space with the assumption that someone would be respectful and understand and want to build that into your therapy. And if they have a bias, that means that they don't really value religion and they think it's brainwashing. They're not going to build that in. And again, they're humans, and that sucks. And like that, and that's why I tell people, when you start with a therapist, like if you think something's off and there's not a good vibe, like go see another therapist. Like there's nothing wrong with that. And if your therapist is offended, then they probably shouldn't be a therapist, and you made the right choice. Because I usually tell people right away, if you know you don't like me, that's fine. Like that's totally okay. But I think faith-based therapy can be really strong, like really great, because if that's already a big part of your life, I love whenever I can say to a client, like, well, you know what, like, how does that connect to your faith? And they can say like, oh, that's a good point. Like, that's a good question, because a lot of the times these things can connect, and the healing process can also connect you to your faith. Especially when it comes to coming up with ways to cope and understand and conceptualize your mental health, because I think sometimes we get into this idea of like, why do I live like this? Why is this my life? Why do I have anxiety? Why do I have depression? How did I get here? And I think sometimes faith can kind of build up that resiliency to like say, there's no reason right now. Like we don't need to come up with a reason for it. So I think sometimes Christian-based therapy, I've heard of horror stories and I've heard of great stories. So just like I was saying, all therapists are people. So I've met people who saw a Christian therapist, and the Christian therapist was like, you don't have depression, you just don't pray hard enough. Like stuff like that, where it's like, whoa, like that's terrifying. But so kind of finding like what it is that you want, how much you want faith to be built in, and asking a therapist straight up, can you do that? Unfortunately, that's an anxiety inducing situation to ask a therapist that question. And I'll acknowledge that, but advocating for yourself in that sense of like, this is what I want built in, and asking before you even make your first session, like even just asking, does this person have the ability to do faith-based counseling? And if they say no, then maybe keep looking.
Yeah. I think it's like, Oh, no, you're good. I was just going to say,
make sure they're licensed is what I was going to say. Some people are like, I saw someone at a church, and I'm like, no, were they a licensed therapist or just someone at a church? Like, that's not the same.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, it's a huge step to even just like acknowledge that you want or need therapy. So like just making sure that you have what you need in a therapy session is like the next step in admitting that like I need therapy or I want therapy. But yeah, I'm in therapy for just like everything, honestly. Shout out Leanne. She is like always emphasizing like for my particular healing, like you need to be connected with yourself, with others, and with God. And like you were saying, like she does, like every session we could probably go like a really long time without talking about God. And then at the end, she ties everything together. So like, how does this relate to your faith? How does this relate to your relationship with God, or like the way you were raised in your faith, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, whoa, it's just mind blowing. Like, it's so helpful to tie in like your faith in therapy. I think there's so much healing in that. And like you said, there's also drawbacks to that as well. It depends. There are horror stories. Luckily, mine is not one of them.
No, I'm so glad to hear that. But that's what I'm saying. Just making sure they're licensed. Like, because usually the horror stories are not licensed, or like super old people that haven't learned much recently. That's terrible. I swear I'm not ageist, but I think but sometimes there's people who worked in the church for a long time and like give advice, but aren't necessarily trained and like on top of like the continued education, like things that change.
Yeah, no, I get it. Like, please do your research before starting.
Yes.
But yeah, so like in my therapy, we talk a lot about trauma, and I know that's something that we were talking about addressing in this podcast as well. I just want to chat a little bit about like trauma in general, because there's like big trauma, big T and little t, and I kind of just want you to touch on that a little bit, because like obviously my trauma compared to like other people's trauma, I may see it as smaller, or even like as bigger than other people's trauma. But I think it's like really important to address like both little t and big T. And everyone has trauma. So if you just want to like talk a little bit about that and how you can find healing in that as well, that'd be great.
Yeah. So at the beginning, I forgot to tell everyone that I'm a certified trauma practitioner. I'm telling you now. I have too many like letters and things that I just like
She
forget.
is licensed. Don't worry.
But that's a big part of my practice, is kind of focusing on trauma. And so big T trauma is whenever you have experienced something that is life-threatening or earth-shattering, in the sense that you cannot maintain safety after that. So big T trauma might be you were held at gunpoint, you watched your family die, being sexually assaulted, raped, being held as like a, what's that called when people hold you hostage, being held hostage, things like that. Those are big T traumas. Like, you, in that moment, you were like, I might die right now. Like, and if I'm not going to die, I'm watching life end. And that's traumatic. Little T traumas are things like, my parents got divorced. I witnessed domestic violence. Can kind of range, depends on your severity of domestic violence, what's going on. But like witnessing violence, sometimes depends on the violence. Little T traumas can also be like some level of sexual assault. But the thing with big T and little T traumas is this is often based on the person's perception. Like, I've had clients who have gone through both big T and little T traumas, but they're caught up on the little T trauma. The big T trauma, they got past it. They're like, okay, I know I'm safe now. We can go past that. But they're caught up on the things that to a random person might seem less severe, but to that person, in their experience, they are just as bad, if not worse. So that's the thing that I like to keep in mind with trauma is pain. We can't compare pain to pain, because pain is based on your perception. So someone might go through their parents getting a divorce, and that might be really painful for them and earth shattering. And someone might go through witnessing a terrorist attack, and that might be really earth shattering for them. But while they're different, and we have a natural tendency to compare them, to each person, that was the biggest like life shattering event that happened, right? Mm-hmm. So that's the thing with trauma that I like to keep in mind, is that these things are all different based on the person who's experiencing them. On top of that, when your trauma takes place, the age in which it takes place can also completely shift whether or not it's considered a big T or a little T. So if you're 2 years old when something really traumatizing happened, it can be like the rest of your life is shaped by that event. If you're 17, you can conceptualize it a little bit better. You can think about what just happened. You can process it a little bit more. You can verbalize it and have support in that process. You might be a little more resilient in that sense. And unfortunately, we come from a culture where people often don't acknowledge when things happen to little kids that they've experienced them. A lot of the times there's the idea of like, oh, they were too young to remember it. And that's not the reality. We have memories as low as 6 months. I've had clients in the past who experienced something in the first 6 months that they don't even know happened. And you can tell that they are traumatized, like the way that they act and the things they say, the way their bodies respond to things. You can tell that their body knows that something happened. And that
there's also like delayed, like remembering things at a delayed rate. Like, yeah, you suppress that until the memories come back. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And so, sometimes people won't even know that they were sexually assaulted until they were 19, and it happened when they were like 10. Things like that, where I've just seen a lot of people whose bodies essentially did the work of helping maintain safety, which means forgetting it. Mm-hmm. So that's the reality of trauma too, is that sometimes your body is so caught up on how do I keep you safe that memories are lost. We get caught into cycles of activation. So like, you might be a thrill seeker, you might be someone who uses substances, like seeking out things that can kind of heal you without necessarily needing to process and confront what happened, because it's that's your body's way of making sure you're okay. So I think that can be really interesting. Like, whenever you are a child, especially, even just like attachment styles, what you witness around you, what you deem as safety and lack thereof, those kinds of things can shape the rest of your life. And so in adulthood, a lot of the people have the privilege of backtracking and figuring out like, what about my childhood shifted the way that I am? What brought me here? How do I manage this? And so trauma also can lead to a lot of alternative coping mechanisms that aren't necessarily the healthiest, but are your body and mind's way of coping with what's going on. So that's kind of why I bring up substance use. I think a lot of the times whenever I've had clients who struggle with substance use, there's a trauma history, and they usually coincide. It's not, it's your body, you're trying to find a way to maintain safety. And so trauma can be really interesting in the sense that it can happen one time and it can change your whole life. It can happen one time, happen again, happen again. You can have these compounded traumas, which build in all these different types of coping, different types of activation. A little bit harder to conceptualize for people who've experienced them, because it's so many things that they can't say, I act this way because of this event. And oftentimes trauma isn't really like that. I act this way because of that. But whenever you experience a traumatizing event, your brain development, depending on your age, this is why it's so important, the age can shift things. Your brain development can literally change. So you can go from someone that has a normally developed brain and it's all functioning and everything's going as it's supposed to, and it can kind of shift to this situation where your brain's nervous system is so activated that your body and brain are used to this cycle of activation. So we all know, like, fight, flight, freeze, like everyone knows what that is. But some people are always in fight, flight, or freeze until they're able to be numbed, which is how people seek out substance use, or why people like to be alone, because those people that they interact with are what activates that reaction. Things like that. So yeah, where, like, your age, what's going on whenever you experience trauma, all of that can kind of shift the way that your body and your brain respond to the situation. It's all really interesting stuff. Yeah. But I mean, also we have like intergenerational trauma. That is something that I think we talk about a lot more as we talk about racism, is if you're a person of color in the US specifically, because I can't speak for other countries, but in the US specifically, you might be raised with certain fears and certain dynamics that kind of shape you to be in a situation where you're traumatized more quickly and more easily than someone that's white might be. So an example of that might be you grow up with a parent who specifically was sought out because of their race and was hurt because of their race, and you then are constantly aware of the fact that that might happen to you. So that's an example of generational trauma, because they didn't actually experience it, but them seeing their parents or knowing that their parents experienced it shifted the way that they function in the world. Another example of that might be like domestic violence. Sometimes when people grow up in an experience where they know that their mom was unsafe, or their dad was unsafe, they start to shift the way that they act out of that same fear, even if they didn't witness any of the violence and they were never there for it. So it's kind of interesting to see parents will kind of give their children the same patterns that they use to cope, which can lead to the cycle of, even though maybe this person didn't actually experience the same trauma, they're responding as though they have, because this is what was taught within the family system. So it can be really interesting. Like, yeah, trauma can be really interesting in the sense where it can just keep trickling down, or we can see patterns where it's like the mom is extremely codependent with the child as a way of maintaining her safety and the child's safety. And then that child goes on to have a child and does the same thing. Kind of these patterns where it's like it all started because of a trauma, but here we are watching it go down 5 generations. Or substance use is another example of that. If your dad's an alcoholic because of something that happened to him, and then you pick up that same behavior. I mean, a lot of this stemmed from a trauma, but here we are continuing the cycle because it never really was acknowledged as a trauma. It was never acknowledged that this person went through a validating and difficult experience that we can acknowledge as difficult. Instead, it's more, especially because we're shifting now, like in the past, a lot of the times with substance use and trauma responses, they were very shamed. And I think now we're getting to the point where there can be conversations about it.
Yeah, I keep thinking about like the cycle of conflict now too, because whenever you were talking about just like parents experiencing trauma and then kind of like passing it on to their children, I think of Ireland and the conflict in Northern Ireland, and just like how 2 generations ago there was all of this conflict in Ireland, and even 2 generations later, like it's still a cycle of conflict. Like they're still in this like loop of trauma and of like hatred and of violence and conflict. And I don't know, I just think that's really interesting. And I don't know, I think in America at least, like we're seeing that like speaking up about these cycles of conflict, like bringing them to light is kind of like breaking the cycle in a way, or trying to break the cycle. So do you think that would be your recommendation for like any trauma? Like how would you first like initially find healing in that trauma, or like start the process of like breaking the cycle type of thing? Yeah.
I think you should to start, you should get a therapist. That's where I would say you should start. And then
if you're in Ohio, go to Ruthie.
Yeah. And then after that, I would say you kind of, so I think especially with like generational and like interpersonal conflicts. So like I was saying earlier with like attachment styles, some families are brought up to believe certain things are healthy, and then they start to grow up and you're like, wait a second, that's a little weird. I don't know why we did that as a family. Like some people kind of do that as they get older, where they're like, wait, am I imagining this? What's going on there? So the reason I say you should start with a therapist is because that gives you a safe space to kind of talk about that and process it. And someone to kind of check in and be like, you know what? Nope, not normal. Here's what we got to do. Like, here's what you can do. Here's what we can acknowledge about that situation. But I think with trauma, especially whenever you're trying to break it down in a family system, you kind of have to be the change. And that's what I think that's why you need a therapist, because you need someone to lean back on whenever maybe you try and it's not responded to well, because people are creatures of habit, and families really like the cycle of how their family exists. Even if it's not healthy, even if it's chaos, that's what is their normal. So a lot of the times with family systems, we see that, I mean, there's this concept of homeostasis, which is the idea that if I went into a family and I did family therapy and I said, here's what you're going to change, you're going to do this thing, and everyone's going to try to do that. Chances are someone in the family will really struggle with that change and will pick up the pace so that they can keep that homeostasis. So if the homeostasis was that one kid specifically was known as being like the black sheep and would always go and do bad things, so then that kid slows down, is like, okay, we're trying out this new thing. Another kid will pick up and do the same stuff because families are used to, this is how we function. That's our normal. So I think, unfortunately, breaking the cycles of trauma involves a lot of internal and personal work and decision-making of saying, like, I'm actually deciding to set up this boundary, and I'm deciding that this will not continue and I will not do this. I see that a lot with people with generally like loose boundaries, like families who moms and dads are expecting a lot of their children, which means like everything that they say goes, even in adulthood. A lot of the times that's a generational trauma issue, where it's, like we said in the beginning, anxiety is a lack of control. So for parents to feel like their kids are safe and that they are safe, they need control over the situation. So in order to stop that cycle, you kind of have to be the one to say, like, actually, you don't get to do that. And it creates tension and it creates conflict. And I think a lot of the times people really struggle with that process because it's not easy. These patterns existed for a reason, because it was protecting someone at some point, and then it became the norm. So with trauma, especially, it's a kind of a tricky process in the sense that with trauma, you can't just immediately decide you're going to change everything overnight, right? Like your body and brain have found calmness in the chaos to some extent. So you have to be able to slowly implement a more eye-opening understanding of like what's actually going on and why we do the things that we do.
Thank you.
I was like, I don't know. Did that answer the every time you ask a question at the end, I'm like, I don't know if I answered it. I think I might have.
So good. It's so good. Oh my God. No, I love it. I had another. Oh, so I'm thinking just like in terms of, this could probably just be the last question in regards to trauma, but like for someone who knows someone who's like a close friend or a family member, like how do you best support someone who like is enduring huge trauma or little trauma, whatever it may be? What do you recommend for just people loving someone through this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that one of the things that people who have trauma responses need the most of and get the least of is patience. So I think sometimes just kind of going into it knowing this person's going through something, and it's not the easiest thing, and it's not easy to constantly say like, I'm going through something and this is why I'm doing this, because oftentimes people don't know that that's what's happening. So as someone who loves that person, the best thing you can do is kind of give them that space and accept apologies, even though maybe it's the third time they've needed to apologize for the same thing, obviously within reason. Like if they're really terrible, like it doesn't matter if they went through trauma, you have a boundary too that you might need to set up. But in general, like being able to love people also means giving them the space to be able to talk about and process that experience and understand themselves a little bit more, which sometimes means a little level of accountability of like, hey, you seem really stressed out and activated right now. Can I do something to help calm you down? Even acknowledging and labeling what's going on around other people. Like, can I do something to help you? Can I give you space? Can I help regulate your nervous system? There's this concept of trauma responses, and it's called co-regulation, which is actually something that's really cool that everyone can do. So when someone is in an activated state because they've experienced trauma, they're not regulated, right? Their bodies aren't regulated. Like I was saying earlier, nervous systems are activated. They're ready to go. Those are the people who are ready to fight when you like ask them like the simplest question and you're like, whoa, like I wasn't ready for that. Like that kind of activation where there's a constant defense because they need to protect themselves. And so what you can do to co-regulate is not feed into that cycle. So when someone's ready to fight and argue with you, you don't do it. You're like, I'm actually not going to do that. I'm not going to create that same cycle. So the concept of co-regulation is that you remain calm. You model the behavior of like, I'm calm and I'm safe and I'm willing to talk to you and I'm willing to support you. And here's what I'm going to do to make that happen. And so often we see co-regulation as a method of helping children who've been traumatized. But essentially at the root of it, even in adulthood, we're still children at heart. We still respond to things sometimes in like a very primal, automatic way without thinking about it. And so you can kind of maintain that same level of co-regulation in adulthood, which just essentially means being there and providing that safe place in the sense that you're not shaming someone for experiencing their trauma. You're not telling someone they need to immediately be better. You're not asking someone, oh, why have you changed? You're understanding that they're going through a change and that they are struggling themselves.
Yeah. We talked about so much and I love all of it. And I knew I was supposed to do a podcast with mental health stuff. It's so fun to talk about.
No, it is so fun to talk about. I agree.
Yeah. I'm almost like, oh my gosh, I want to go get my degree now. Let's go right now.
All hyped up.
Yeah, no, but thank you. And like for everyone who is listening or watching this, we will be doing a part 2 on just like pandemic trauma in general, because this is going to be present for all of us, and kind of just like coping mechanisms for that, or ways that we can be aware of it and help other people through it, but also like you were saying, set boundaries for yourself and like help yourself through any trauma that comes from the pandemic. So stay tuned for that. It'll be great, I'm sure. Ruthie, the ever intelligent.
No. Well, thanks for having me. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, thank you. And I don't know if you have any like last things to say, whatever you want.
Yeah, I can tie it all together. I can bring us back to the beginning. Yeah, so basically you should seek out therapy if you feel like you might benefit from it. That's my number one, which all people would benefit from it, just saying. It doesn't need to be like a long, like weekly thing. Some people like to just go every once in a while and get a little caught up, start to challenge some internalized beliefs. But I think with where we started with like the concept of religiosity, and then we ended with trauma, like religion can kind of give you that safe space to heal from trauma too. And community can kind of help you in that sense of having people that you know can understand and help you and guide you in a way that's loving and accepting and safe, as opposed to some of the times with trauma, we have a sense of internalized shame that makes you question, why did this happen to me? What did I do that made this happen to me? And that sense of community can kind of help you understand that. And I think what's really cool about faith is that a lot of people were brought to their faith because of something that they went through that was really hard. And it kind of gives you that shoulder to lean on that doesn't go anywhere. They're not leaving. And I think that's a really special part of faith. But that's kind of one of the ways you can build up resilience overall too, is just having that space where you're willing to be able to say, like, here are some things that I went through, and that doesn't mean that this is my story and that it's written and that this is the end for me. It just means that I have some healing to do, and I have to find people and communities that can help me do that. And sometimes faith can be that. But that's it. That's my ending. That's my closing thought.
But yeah, I actually, like, obviously I'm a big advocate for faith and like applying that for healing and just like giving over control to God in general. But obviously that's like a personal choice for people. And I do recommend just looking into therapy in general and just being mindful about like who you are, what you're struggling with, and how you connect with yourself, others, and God. Like my therapist always tells me, or not God, if that's not something you roll with. But I think it's so important to talk about mental health and religiosity in general. And I think it needs to be spoken up about a lot more. So thank you for speaking up about it with me.
Yeah, thanks for giving me a place to do that.
Yes, it's amazing, and we'll continue with it soon.
Yes. Second part 2, pandemic chaos.
Pandemic chaos. It's real fun. Okay, thank you, Ruthie, and
Bye.
bye everyone.